The mechanic went to the wrong table for his date and ended up meeting the love of his life in the wheelchair. Robert Johnson had cold, sweaty hands as he entered the Mountain Corner restaurant in downtown Chicago. At 38 years old, the mechanic hadn't dated anyone in the past 5 years, since the end of his marriage. His best friend Melissa had insisted so much for him to accept this blind date that he finally gave in, even against his will. Nervous and late because of traffic, Robert quickly looked around, searching for a blonde woman in a red dress, as Melissa had described. He spotted a table in the corner where a blonde woman was sitting alone and walked toward her without thinking twice. Only when he sat down did he realize she was in a wheelchair and wearing a light blue blouse, not a red dress. His face turned red with embarrassment. "Sorry, I think I got the wrong table," said Robert, already getting up. But the woman smiled so warmly that he hesitated. "It's okay, it happens," she replied with a soft voice. "I'm also waiting for someone who seems like they won't show up. I'm Helen Anderson." Robert introduced himself and, without knowing why, sat back down. Helen was about 35 years old, with wavy blonde hair that fell over her shoulders and green eyes that sparkled even in the restaurant's soft lighting. There was something about her presence that made him feel at ease, different from any date he had ever had. "I've been here for an hour already," said Helen, playing with her napkin. "I think I got stood up too." Robert noticed the irony of the situation. There they were, each waiting for a different person, and they ended up meeting by mistake. He decided to be honest about his situation. "To be frank, I didn't even want to be here," Robert confessed. "My friend forced me to accept this date. It's been years since I've gone out with anyone." "I understand perfectly," Helen chuckled softly. "My sister kept pushing me too. She said I needed to stop using work as an excuse to not have a social life." They continued talking while waiting for their respective dates. Robert learned that Helen was a physical therapist and had her own practice in the Lincoln Park area. She discovered that he had inherited an auto repair shop from his father in the Wicker Park neighborhood and had been working there since he was 18 years old. "You know, it's strange," said Helen, playing with her water glass. "I've never felt so comfortable talking with someone I just met." Robert agreed with a nod. There was something natural about their conversation, as if they had known each other for a long time. He was about to comment on this when his phone rang. "Robert, where are you?" came Melissa's frantic voice. "Patricia is furious. She said you never even showed up." "What do you mean I didn't show up? I'm here at the restaurant," Robert replied, confused, stepping away from the table slightly. "Are you at table 12? Because she's at table 15 and has been waiting for you for an hour." Robert felt his stomach drop. He looked around and saw the number of the table where he was sitting. 7. He had sat at the completely wrong table. His gaze returned to Helen, who was watching him curiously. I need to take care of something," said Robert, hanging up the phone. He returned to the table with his heart racing. Now he had a dilemma: tell Helen that it had all been a mistake or make up some excuse to leave. "Problems?" asked Helen, noticing his tense expression. "No, nothing serious," Robert lied, deciding on impulse not to tell her about the misunderstanding. Something inside him couldn't accept the idea of getting up from that table. "It was just a friend confirming another appointment." Helen nodded, but Robert noticed she had caught his hesitation. To cover it up, he called the waiter and asked for the menu. "How about we have dinner together?" suggested Robert. Since our meetings didn't work out, at least we're not alone." "I'd love that." Helen smiled, and Robert felt a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. During dinner, they discovered shared interests that went far beyond what they expected. Both enjoyed old movies, had lost their parents while still young, and carried scars from relationships that hadn't worked out. Robert told her about his complicated divorce 3 years earlier. "My ex-wife said I didn't have enough ambition." Robert pushed his food around without appetite, that a mechanic could never give her the kind of life she deserved. "People sometimes don't understand that there's dignity in any honest work," said Helen sincerely, "and that a person's worth isn't measured by what they do but by who they are." Robert looked into her eyes and felt she truly believed that. There was no pity or judgment in her voice, only understanding. "And you?" asked Robert. "Why is someone like you single?" Helen hesitated for a moment, swirling her wine. "It's complicated," she said finally. "Most men see me as a good friend, someone to talk to about problems, but never as a romantic possibility." Robert found that impossible to believe. Helen was smart, beautiful, successful, and had a smile that lit up the room. How could men not see that? "Maybe you're meeting the wrong men," said Robert, immediately regretting how direct it sounded. "Maybe," Helen smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Robert couldn't help but notice. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, the dinner lasted over 3 hours. They talked about everything: childhood, dreams, fears, plans for the future. Robert discovered that Helen had opened her own practice after years working in public hospitals, wanting more autonomy to help her patients. "I mainly work with rehabilitating people who've suffered accidents," explained Helen. "It's rewarding to see someone regain movements they thought they'd lost forever." "It must be hard dealing with so much suffering every day," commented Robert. "Sometimes it is," Helen agreed. "But it's also hope. Every small victory from a patient reminds me why I chose this profession." Robert admired the passion with which she spoke about her work. It was obvious Helen didn't do it just for money, but because she genuinely cared about people. When they finally left the restaurant, it was past 11 at night. Robert walked Helen to her car, adapted for her needs, and was impressed by her independence. "This was an unexpected night," said Helen, with the smile Robert was already beginning to love. "Thank you for staying." "I should be thanking you," Robert replied sincerely. "It's been a long time since I felt so good talking with someone." They exchanged phone numbers before saying goodbye. Robert stood in the parking lot watching Helen drive away, with a strange feeling in his chest. It was as if part of him was leaving with her. The next day, Robert couldn't concentrate at work. He kept checking his phone to see if Helen had sent any messages. Finally, in the middle of the afternoon, he decided to call her. "Hi, Robert." Her voice sounded cheerful on the other end of the line. "How was your day?" They talked for almost an hour. Helen told him about a new patient who had come to her practice, an elderly lady who had suffered a stroke and was very discouraged about physical therapy. Robert talked about an old car he was restoring in his spare time. "You know, I was thinking," said Robert, gathering courage. "How about we have dinner together again? But this time on purpose, not by mistake." "I'd love to." The answer came without hesitation, making Robert smile. They scheduled for the following Saturday at an Italian restaurant in the Gold Coast neighborhood. Robert spent the whole week anxious, but it was a good kind of anxiety, different from the nervousness he had felt the previous week. On Saturday, he arrived at the restaurant a few minutes before the scheduled time and chose a table in a more secluded corner. When he saw Helen arriving, his heart raced. She was wearing a navy blue dress that enhanced her green eyes and had done a more elaborate hairstyle. "You look beautiful," said Robert, standing up to greet her. "Thank you." Helen blushed slightly. "You look very nice too." The second date was even better than the first. Without the initial tension of the misunderstanding, they could focus on getting to know each other better. Robert told about his childhood in the working-class neighborhood, son of a mechanic who worked 16 hours a day to support the family. "My father always said that work doesn't dishonor anyone," Robert recalled fondly. "He died when I was 25 from working so much. Sometimes I think I inherited more than his workshop. I also inherited this need to prove that I'm worthy of something." "And you are," said Helen, gently touching his hand on the table. "You didn't need to prove anything to anyone." Robert felt a shiver at her touch. It had been a long time since a woman had shown him affection so naturally and spontaneously. "And your family?" asked Robert. Helen said she had grown up in an upper-middle-class family. Her father had been an engineer and her mother a university professor. She had a younger sister who lived in New York and a mother who, according to her, was a bit too controlling. "My mother always wanted to control every aspect of my life," said Helen with a sigh. "Especially after—" She hesitated as if unsure whether to continue. "After what?" Robert asked gently. After my accident, Helen said softly. It's been 10 years. I was coming back from my last wedding rehearsal when a truck ran a red light. Robert felt his chest tighten. Helen had lost not only the use of her legs but also her engagement on the same day. My fiancé at the time, he couldn't handle the situation, Helen continued, fidgeting with the napkin as she had on the first date. He said he still loved me, but as a brother, no longer as a fiancé. I'm sorry, said Robert, and he truly meant it. He couldn't imagine the pain Helen had faced. It was hard for a long time, Helen admitted. But I learned that some losses are necessary for us to discover who really cares about us. Robert realized the strength behind those words. Helen wasn't complaining. She was sharing a life lesson. When they left the restaurant that night, Robert offered to walk her to her car again. This time he mustered the courage for something he had wanted to do since the first date. Helen, he said, gently holding her hand. Can I kiss you? She smiled and leaned in. It was a soft, tender kiss, full of unspoken promises. When they pulled away, Robert saw tears in her eyes. Is everything okay? He asked worriedly. It's perfect, Helen replied, wiping the tears. It had been a long time since someone kissed me as if I were complete. Robert held her face in his hands. You are complete, he said with conviction. You're the most amazing woman I've ever met. In the days that followed, Robert and Helen talked on the phone every day. He started stopping by her office after work, always with some excuse, bringing a coffee, asking about her day, or simply seeing her for a few minutes. Helen was radiant whenever he appeared. Her secretary, Mrs. Barbara, a 65-year-old woman who had worked with her since the practice opened, quickly noticed the change in her boss's behavior. Dr. Helen, I haven't seen you this happy in years, Mrs. Barbara remarked one afternoon after Robert had left. Is it really that obvious? Helen asked, blushing. For someone who spends every day with you, it is. Mrs. Barbara smiled. And I can tell he's a kind-hearted young man. I saw how he treated Mr. Joachim this morning. Helen recalled the scene. Joachim, an elderly patient recovering from hip surgery, had stumbled at the entrance of the practice. Robert, who had just arrived, immediately helped him with care and patience, talking with him until he was sure he was okay. He really is special, Helen agreed, feeling a warmth in her chest. Meanwhile, at the workshop, Robert couldn't hide his happiness either. His longest-serving employee, old George, 67, who had worked with Robert's father and was now like a second father to him, noticed the change. Son, you're different, old George said one afternoon as they worked together on an engine. There's a sparkle in your eyes I haven't seen in a long time. I met someone special, Robert confessed, unable to hide his smile. That's good, my boy, old George patted him on the shoulder. After that situation with Amanda, it was about time you found someone who values you. Robert nodded. Amanda had been his ex-wife, a relationship that lasted 5 years and ended bitterly. She had always criticized his profession, saying he didn't have enough ambition. After 3 weeks of meeting almost every day, Robert decided to introduce Helen to Melissa, his best friend since childhood. They scheduled a lunch at a restaurant downtown. Melissa, a 40-year-old lawyer, divorced and mother of 2, arrived at the restaurant already curious to meet the woman who was making her friend smile so much. So, you're the famous Helen, Melissa said, greeting her warmly. Robert talks about nothing else. He exaggerates, Helen laughed, but Robert noticed she was pleased with the comment. During lunch, Melissa bombarded Helen with questions about her profession, her family, her tastes. Robert felt a bit apprehensive, knowing his friend's straightforward manner, but Helen answered everything with patience and good humor. You have such a positive energy, Melissa told Helen. You can tell you're someone who enjoys life. I learned to love it again, Helen replied, looking at Robert. Sometimes we need to go through losses to appreciate what really matters. After Helen left, Melissa pulled Robert aside. Robert, I need to tell you something, she said with a serious expression. What is it? Robert asked, noticing the change in his friend's tone. That night of the blind date, remember I called you saying Patricia was furious because you didn't show up? I remember, Robert nodded, starting to feel a chill in his stomach. I found out you were at the wrong table the whole time, Melissa said quietly. Patricia was at table 15, and you were at table 7 with Helen. Robert felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. He had lied to Helen from day one. Their entire relationship was built on a lie. Robert, you need to tell her, Melissa continued. You can't build a serious relationship on a lie, even if it was unintentional at first. She'll hate me, Robert said, running his hand through his hair. She'll think I deceived her on purpose. Or she'll understand that fate brought you together, Melissa tried to reassure him. But you need to tell her before she finds out some other way. Robert left the restaurant with a heavy heart. How could he tell Helen that the entire beginning of their relationship had been a lie? He had lied on the very first day and kept lying every day since. That night, when Helen called as she always did before going to sleep, Robert almost told her the truth 3 times, but couldn't bring himself to do it. How could he risk losing the woman who had completely changed his life? You're quiet today, Helen commented. Did something happen? No, just tired, Robert lied once again. It was a long day at the workshop. Do you want me to come over tomorrow after work? I can give you a back massage, Helen offered. I'd love that, Robert replied, feeling his chest tighten with guilt. Over the following days, Robert grew increasingly distressed. Every time Helen talked about how important trust was in a relationship, he felt worse. She mentioned that she had learned to value honesty after being deceived by some people after the accident. You know what hurts me the most? Helen said one evening while they were having dinner at her place. It's when people lie to protect me, as if I'm too fragile to handle the truth. Robert nearly choked on his food. That was exactly what he was doing. A week later, the situation became even more complicated when Helen suggested they go to dinner at the same restaurant where they had met, to celebrate 1 month since their first date. It'll be romantic, she said excitedly, going back to the place where it all began. Robert agreed, but inside he was desperate. How could he return to that place knowing he had lied about how everything had happened? On the appointed day, they met at Mountain Corner. Helen had chosen table 7, the same one where they had sat that first night. It's amazing to think that if you hadn't sat at my table by mistake, we might never have met, said Helen, holding his hand across the table. Robert felt his stomach turn to ice. She knew, or at least suspected something. Helen, I need to tell you something, Robert began, gathering all his courage. But at that moment, her phone rang. It was an emergency from the hospital. One of her patients, a 12-year-old boy who was in rehabilitation after spinal surgery, had had a serious fall during a physical therapy session with another professional and was being taken to the emergency room. I have to go, said Helen, already getting up. Gabriel is scared and only trusts me. I'll come with you, said Robert without hesitation. They rushed to St. Luke's Hospital in downtown Chicago. On the way, Helen explained that Gabriel Wilson was a boy from a very poor family who had fallen from a tree 6 months ago and fractured 3 vertebrae. He had been regaining some movement when this second fall happened. At the hospital, Robert was impressed seeing Helen in action. She spoke with the doctors, calmed the boy's desperate parents, and got Gabriel to stop crying just by holding his hand. Aunt Helen, will I be able to walk again? Asked Gabriel, his eyes full of tears. We'll fight for that together, my love, Helen replied, kissing his forehead. But even if that doesn't happen, you'll still be the bravest boy I know. Robert felt a surge of emotion watching that scene. Helen wasn't just being professional, she truly loved what she did. Auntie, who is that man? Gabriel asked, pointing at Robert. He's my boyfriend, Helen said, looking at Robert affectionately. Robert, this is Gabriel, my most special patient. Hi, Gabriel. Robert approached the bed. Your Aunt Helen talks about you a lot. She's the best physical therapist in the world, Gabriel said proudly. I completely agree, Robert smiled. They stayed at the hospital until Gabriel fell asleep. The boy's parents, Mr. John and Mrs. Mary, thanked Helen emotionally for her dedication. Doctor, you saved our son, said Mrs. Mary, holding Helen's hands. We can never repay such kindness. You don't need to repay anything, Helen replied. Taking care of Gabriel is an honor for me. When they finally left the hospital, it was past 2 in the morning. Robert walked Helen to her car, thinking about how he admired that woman even more after what he had witnessed. "Thank you for staying with me," said Helen. "I know it wasn't your obligation." "Of course it was," Robert answered. "Robert, everything that's important to you is important to me." Helen kissed him right there in the hospital parking lot, a kiss full of gratitude and affection. "Robert, can you take me home?" she asked. "I'm too tired to drive." "Of course," Robert answered immediately. On the way to her house in the Beverly Hills neighborhood, Robert took the opportunity to observe the area where Helen lived more closely. It was an upscale region of Chicago with large, well-maintained houses. Her house was a modern construction, with access ramps and several adaptations for her needs. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Helen offered. "If it's not a bother," Robert accepted. Helen's house was cozy and well decorated, with a mix of modern furniture and antique pieces that created a welcoming atmosphere. Robert noticed that everything was at the ideal height for her, and there were support bars strategically placed. "Did you make all these adaptations yourself?" asked Robert. "Some I did. Others were gifts from my mother," Helen replied, preparing the coffee. "She became obsessed with making everything perfect for me after the accident." "She must love you very much," commented Robert. "She does, but sometimes in a suffocating way," Helen sighed. "She never fully accepted my independence after the accident." They sat in the living room, drinking coffee and talking about the day. Robert noticed how tired Helen was, but still radiant from having helped Gabriel. "You're an amazing person," Robert said suddenly. "The way you dedicate yourself to your patients, how you care about them. It's admirable." "Thank you," Helen smiled. "Sometimes I think I dedicate myself so much to work to escape other aspects of life." "How so?" "Relationships," she said simply. "It's easier to take care of others than to risk getting hurt again." Robert understood perfectly what she meant. He had also used work as an escape after his divorce. "But with you it's different," Helen continued, looking into his eyes. "I don't feel afraid. I feel like I can trust you completely." Robert felt a pang of guilt in his chest. There was Helen, talking about trust, and he was hiding the truth about how they met. "Helen, he began, but she interrupted him. "Robert, I know it's still early, but I need to tell you something." She held his hands. "I'm falling in love with you." Robert felt the world spin. There was the most incredible woman he had ever met, declaring her feelings, and he couldn't do the same without first confessing his lie. "I'm falling in love with you too," he said sincerely. "More than I ever thought possible." They kissed there on the living room sofa, a kiss charged with emotion and promises. When they separated, Helen rested her head on his chest. "You know, I always thought I'd never find someone who would see me as a woman first, before seeing my limitations," she said softly. "Because you are a woman first," Robert replied, stroking her hair. "Everything else is just detail." They stayed embraced on the couch until Helen fell asleep. Robert carefully carried her to the bedroom, covered her, and gave a gentle kiss on her forehead before leaving. On his way home, Robert made a decision. He would tell the whole truth to Helen the next day. No matter the risk, she deserved to know. But when he got home, he found 3 missed calls from Melissa. When he returned the call, his friend was desperate. "Robert, something really bad happened," Melissa said as soon as she answered. "What is it?" Robert asked, feeling his heart race. "Helen's mother found out about you too," Melissa said quickly. "She came to see me at the office today. She said she hired a detective to investigate your past." Robert felt his legs tremble. "A detective? Why?" "Apparently she didn't approve when Helen told her about you," Melissa explained. "And Robert, there's more. She found out about the mix-up on the first night. The detective talked to the waiter at the restaurant and some people who were there that night." Robert sat down heavily on the couch. His lie had been discovered in the worst possible way. "Is she going to tell Helen?" Robert asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Melissa replied. "But Robert, you need to tell her before she does. Helen deserves to hear the truth from you." Robert hung up the phone and stayed awake all night, trying to find a way to tell Helen without losing the woman who had become his reason for living. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The next morning, Robert arrived at the workshop earlier than usual. Old George immediately noticed something was wrong. "Son, you look like you didn't sleep a wink," commented the senior employee. "Old George, what would you do if you had lied to someone very important at the beginning of the relationship, without any ill intent, but now didn't know how to tell the truth?" Robert asked, needing advice. Old George stopped what he was doing and looked seriously at Robert. "Son, a lie is like rust on metal," he said wisely. "If you don't clean it off right at the start, it will corrode everything. But if you clean it carefully and apply a new coat of paint, the metal becomes stronger than before. Even if the person might never forgive me? If it's the right person, they will forgive." Old George patted him on the shoulder. "And if they don't, then they weren't the right person after all." Robert spent the whole morning rehearsing how he would tell Helen. He decided to call her and arrange a meeting in the afternoon, but when he picked up the phone, he saw that he had 3 missed calls from her. When he returned the call, Helen's voice sounded different, colder. "Robert, I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. "Can you come to my office now?" "Of course, I'm on my way," Robert replied, feeling a chill in his stomach. The traffic to Lincoln Park never seemed so long. Robert imagined 1,000 scenarios of how Helen had discovered the truth. When he arrived at the office, Mrs. Barbara greeted him with a worried expression. "The doctor is waiting for you in her office," she said simply. Robert entered Helen's office and immediately noticed that something had drastically changed. She was sitting behind the desk, more serious than he had ever seen her. "Sit down," Helen said, indicating the chair in front of the desk. Robert sat down, preparing for the worst. "My mother came to visit me this morning," Helen began, her voice controlled. "She told me some interesting things about our first night at the restaurant." Robert closed his eyes. It was exactly what he had feared. "Helen, I can explain—" "Can you?" she interrupted him. "Because my mother told me that you were at the wrong table that night, that he had a date with another woman and sat at my table by mistake." Robert took a deep breath. It was the moment of truth. "It's true," he said quietly. "I was at the wrong table." Helen stayed silent for a few seconds, processing the confirmation. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally asked. "Because the moment I met you, I didn't want to know any other woman," Robert said sincerely. "And then it became harder and harder to tell because I knew you'd think I had lied on purpose." "And you didn't lie?" Helen asked, her eyes welling up. "At first it wasn't a lie. It was omission," Robert tried to explain. "But then, every day that passed without me telling you, it did become a lie." "So you mean that all this time, every time I talked about trust, about how important it was to be honest, you knew you were deceiving me?" Robert saw a tear roll down Helen's face and felt his heart shatter. "Helen, please, let me explain properly," he begged. "I never meant to hurt you." "Do you know what hurts the most?" Helen said, wiping her tears. "It's not even the deception of that first night. It's knowing that you thought I was too fragile to handle the truth. Exactly what I told you hurt me about people." Robert realized he had made the very mistake Helen hated the most. He had lied to protect her. "You're right to be angry," Robert said, standing up. "I ruined everything, but you have to believe that my feelings for you are real. Everything I felt, everything I experienced with you was real." "How can I believe that?" Helen asked, her voice breaking. "If you lied about the beginning, how do I know you didn't lie about the rest?" Robert didn't know what to say. He had lost the right to ask for trust. "I think you should go," Helen finally said. "I need to think." Robert headed for the door but stopped before leaving. "Helen, I love you," he said without turning around. "I know that doesn't mean anything to you now, but I had to say it." He left the office without waiting for a reply. In the elevator, Robert leaned against the wall, feeling he had lost the most precious thing in his life because of his own cowardice. 2 weeks passed with no contact between them. Robert buried himself in work, staying at the workshop until late hours to try not to think about the pain he felt. Old George tried to cheer him up, but Robert could barely eat or sleep. "Son, why don't you go after her?" asked Old George one afternoon. "Because she made it clear she doesn't want to see me anymore," Robert replied, distractedly tinkering with an engine. "And you're just going to give up like that?" "I'm the one who ruined everything, Old George. I have no right to insist." Meanwhile, Helen was also suffering. Mrs. Barbara noticed that her boss was downcast, without the sparkle in her eyes that she had regained in recent weeks. "Doctor, it's none of my business, but Mr. Robert seems like a good young man," Mrs. Barbara commented one afternoon. "Sometimes people do wrong things for the right reasons." "He lied to me, Mrs. Barbara," Helen said wearily. "How can I trust someone who lied to me from day one?" "Have you ever lied to someone to avoid hurting them?" Helen thought about the question. She remembered a few times she had omitted things from patients or family members to spare them unnecessary suffering. "It's different," she murmured. "Is it really?" Mrs. Barbara asked gently. That afternoon, Helen received an unexpected visitor. It was Melissa, Robert's friend. "Can I talk to you?" Melissa asked, entering the office. "If it's to defend Robert, you don't need to," Helen said coldly. "I didn't come to defend anyone," Melissa replied. "I came to tell the whole truth." Helen listened as Melissa explained the whole situation, how the meeting had been arranged, how Robert was nervous and didn't want to go, how he had sat at the wrong table out of pure nervousness. "He called me the next day completely transformed," Melissa told. "Said he'd met the woman of his life, but there was a problem. He didn't know how to say it had all been a mistake at first." "Why didn't he just say it?" "Because he fell in love with you from the first moment," Melissa said simply, "and he was afraid you'd think he was playing with your feelings." Helen heard the whole story, including how Robert had become desperate when he learned her mother had found out everything. "He was going to tell you that day," Melissa revealed, "at the restaurant before the hospital. I had given him an ultimatum. Either he told you or I would." Helen remembered the night at the hospital, how Robert had started to say something but was interrupted by the emergency with Gabriel. "Helen, I've known Robert for 20 years, Melissa continued. "I've never seen him as happy as in the last few weeks. Not even at his wedding was he this radiant." "And now?" Helen asked quietly. "Now he's devastated," Melissa answered honestly. "He's stopped eating properly, doesn't sleep, just works. I think he's lost hope that you might forgive him." After Melissa left, Helen stayed alone in her office, rethinking everything that had happened. She remembered every moment she had spent with Robert, every conversation, every affectionate gesture. It was true that he had lied, but it was also true that everything else had been real. The care with which he treated her, the way he looked at her, the dedication he showed at the hospital with Gabriel. That night, Helen decided to do something she hadn't done since the accident. She drove to Robert's workshop. It was almost 10 at night when she arrived in the Wicker Park neighborhood. The workshop was still open, and she could see Robert working alone under the light of a lamp. Helen watched for a few minutes before approaching. Robert was visibly thinner, with deep dark circles and a sad expression she had never seen. "Robert," she called from the workshop entrance. He turned, surprised, dropping the tool he was using. "Helen, what are you doing here?" "I came to talk," she said, slowly entering the workshop. "Your friend Melissa came to see me today." Robert closed his eyes. "Helen, I didn't ask her to do that." "I know," Helen interrupted him. "But she did, and she told me some things I needed to know." They stayed silent for a few seconds, just looking at each other. "You've lost weight," Helen commented with concern. "I haven't been able to eat much," Robert admitted. "Robert, can I ask you a question?" "Of course. If you could go back in time, would you tell the truth right on the first day?" Robert thought for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know," he replied. "Because if I had told you, maybe you would have left, and I never would have had the chance to really get to know you." "And was it worth it?" Helen asked. "Is all this pain now worth it for the weeks we spent together?" "Every second," Robert answered without hesitation. "Because even if I've lost you now, I know what it's like to truly love someone." Helen felt her eyes fill with tears. "You haven't lost me," she said softly. Robert lifted his head, not believing what he was hearing. "What?" "I said you haven't lost me," Helen repeated, moving closer to him. "I'm here, aren't I?" "But what about the lie and the trust?" "You lied about how we met," Helen said, stopping right in front of him. "But you didn't lie about your feelings." "And that's what matters," Robert felt tears streaming down his face. "Helen, I love you too," she interrupted him. "And if you promise to never hide anything from me again, we can start over." Robert took her in his arms, careful as always, and kissed her as if it were the first and last time. "I promise," he murmured against her lips. "I'll never hide anything from you again." "Not even if it's to protect me," Helen insisted. "Not even to protect you," Robert agreed. They kissed again in the workshop, lit only by the work lamp, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal. But for them, nothing else existed except that moment of reconciliation. "Want to come home with me?" Helen asked when they separated. "I'll cook something for you. You're too thin." "I'd love to." Robert smiled, the first genuine smile in 2 weeks. They went to Helen's house, where she made a simple sandwich while Robert took a shower. When he came out, he found the table set with care and Helen waiting for him. "Thank you," Robert said, referring to much more than the food. "Thank you," Helen replied, "for teaching me that I can trust again." During dinner, they talked about everything that had happened during their 2 weeks apart. Robert told how he had thought about moving to another city, thinking he couldn't stay in Chicago, seeing the places they used to go together. "Good thing you didn't do that," Helen said. "Because I thought about moving too. I thought I couldn't work knowing you were so close." "Good thing neither of us left," Robert smiled. "Yeah," Helen agreed. "Sometimes running away isn't the solution." After dinner, they sat on the living room sofa, talking until late. Robert told about his difficult childhood, about how his father had worked so hard that he died early, about his fear of not being good enough for anyone. "My ex-wife always said I had no ambition," Robert confessed, "that any real man would want more from life than a mechanic's workshop." "She was wrong," Helen said firmly. "Honest work is honest work, whether it's in a workshop or an office. And you have more character than many men I've met with diplomas on the wall." Robert felt enormous relief hearing that. Helen truly valued him for who he was, not for what he had or didn't have. "And you?" asked Robert. "What was it like growing up in the family you had?" Helen told about the constant pressure to be perfect, about how her parents had very high expectations and how she always felt obliged to meet them. "After the accident, my mother became even more controlling," Helen explained. "She thinks she needs to protect me from everything and everyone. That's why she didn't like me," Robert understood. "She thinks you deserve someone better." "She doesn't understand that better doesn't mean richer or more educated," Helen said. "Better means someone who makes me happy, and you do." They fell asleep holding each other on the sofa, for the first time in 2 weeks sleeping peacefully. The next morning, Helen woke up first and watched Robert sleep. He looked younger that way, without the worries showing on his face. She knew they would still have challenges ahead, especially with her mother, but she was willing to fight for that love. When Robert woke up, he found Helen in the kitchen preparing breakfast. "Good morning," he said, kissing her gently. "Good morning," she replied, pouring the coffee. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than in 2 weeks," Robert admitted. During breakfast, they made plans for the day. Helen had some patients in the morning, and Robert needed to finish an urgent job at the workshop. "How about having dinner together tonight?" Helen suggested. "I can cook something special." "I'd love that," Robert accepted. "But let me bring something. I can't always show up empty-handed." "You never show up empty-handed," Helen smiled. "You always bring your presents, and that's enough." Robert kissed her once more before leaving. On his way to the workshop, he felt renewed, as if he had recovered a part of himself that was lost. At the workshop, old George noticed the change immediately. "Well, well," said the senior employee, smiling. "Looks like the rust has been cleaned and a fresh coat of paint applied." "How did you know?" Robert asked, also smiling. "Son, when you're over 60, you learn to read people's expressions," old George laughed. "You've got life back in your eyes." "She forgave me, old George," Robert shared, emotional. "And she said she loves me. I told you if she was the right woman, she'd forgive." The older man patted his shoulder. "Now just don't mess it up again." "I won't mess it up," Robert promised. "I've learned my lesson." During the day, Robert and Helen exchanged several text messages, easing the longing and planning dinner. Helen had decided to cook Robert's favorite dish, chicken with okra, which she had discovered in a previous conversation. In the late afternoon, when Robert arrived at Helen's house, he brought flowers and a small bottle of simple wine. "For our new first night," he said, handing over the gifts. "It's beautiful." Helen smiled, smelling the flowers. "I'll put them in a vase." Dinner was perfect. Helen had put great care into the food, and Robert brought funny stories from the workshop to make her laugh. It was as if the 2 weeks of separation had served to make them appreciate even more what they had together. "Helen, can I ask you a question?" Robert said during dessert. "Of course." "What exactly did your mother say about me?" Helen hesitated for a moment. "She said you didn't have enough education, that you were from a different social class than ours, and that you were probably interested in my money," Helen shared, seeing Robert tense up. "She also said she had hired a detective who found out you had 3 relationships that didn't work out in the last 10 years. Robert felt a chill in his stomach. "And what do you think about that?" "I think my mother is afraid of seeing me happy," Helen answered sincerely. "Because if I'm happy with someone, she won't be the most important person in my life anymore." "And about the relationships that didn't work out?" Helen held his hand across the table. "Everyone has a past, Robert," she said gently. "What matters is the present, and in the present, you're with me." Robert felt relieved, but he knew they still had to deal with Helen's mother's opposition. "She's going to try to break us up," Robert said worriedly. "Leave it to me," Helen said with determination. "It's about time I set boundaries with my mother." That night, they made their reconciliation official by making love for the first time. It was a tender and careful moment, full of the love they had almost lost and gratitude for being together again. The next morning, they were woken up by the insistent ringing of the doorbell. Helen looked through the peephole and saw her mother at the door, accompanied by a man in a suit she didn't know. "It's my mother," Helen told Robert. "With a man I don't know." "Do you want me to hide?" Robert asked, half jokingly. "Not a chance," Helen replied firmly. "It's time for a confrontation." Helen opened the door to find her mother, Mrs. Diana Anderson, a 63-year-old elegant and imposing lady, accompanied by a well-dressed man. "Mother." "What a surprise," said Helen, showing no embarrassment. "I didn't know you were coming." "I need to speak with you urgently," Mrs. Diana said, entering without an invitation. "This is Dr. Richard, my lawyer." Robert appeared in the living room, wearing the previous day's clothes, making it clear he had spent the night there. "Good morning, Mrs. Diana," Robert greeted politely. "Mr. Robert," Mrs. Diana replied coldly, ignoring the greeting. "I see you've gotten back together." "Yes, we have," Helen confirmed, standing by Robert's side. "And we won't separate again." "Helen, I need to show you some things," Mrs. Diana said, pulling a folder from her bag. "Dr. Richard investigated this man's past more deeply." "Mom, I didn't ask you to investigate anyone," Helen said, getting irritated. "But I did," Mrs. Diana retorted. "As your mother, it's my duty to protect you." Dr. Richard opened the folder and began to read. "Robert Johnson Smith, 38 years old, incomplete high school education, 3 failed relationships between 2019 and 2024, approximate monthly income of 4,000 Rs, no assets of his own beyond an inherited auto repair shop." "Enough!" Helen shouted, surprising everyone. "I'm not going to stand here listening to this." "Helen, dear, you need to see the reality." Mrs. Diana tried to soften her tone. "This man has nothing to offer you." "He offers me love," Helen retorted. "Something money can't buy." "Love doesn't pay the bills," Dr. Richard interjected. "Besides, we have evidence that Mr. Robert lied to your daughter about how you met." Robert, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. "It's true," he said, surprising everyone. "I lied to Helen about our first night. I've already apologized and she's forgiven me. As for the rest, it's also true. I don't have a college degree, I don't have much money, and yes, I had relationships that didn't work out before I met your daughter." "See?" Mrs. Diana said triumphantly. "He admits it himself." "But what the doctor didn't say," Robert continued, looking directly at Mrs. Diana, "is that I've worked honestly since I was 16, that I supported my family until my father passed, that I've never taken on debts I couldn't pay, and that I love your daughter more than my own life." "Pretty words don't change the facts," Dr. Richard insisted. "And what facts are those?" Helen asked, furious. "That Robert is honest? That he works hard? That he treats me with affection and respect?" "The facts are that you're from different worlds," Mrs. Diana said. "He'll never be able to give you the kind of life you deserve." "Mum, the life I deserve is a happy life," Helen retorted. "And with him, I am happy." "For now," Dr. Richard commented. "But when reality hits, when you realize you can't go to the same places, have the same friends, take the same trips—" "Dr. Richard," Robert interrupted him politely, "with all due respect, you don't know us. You don't know what we're capable of when we're together." "I know you're a gold digger," Dr. Richard said bluntly, "who saw a well-off woman and decided to take advantage of the situation." Robert felt his blood boil, but he controlled himself. "If I were a gold digger, I would have lied about my financial situation," Robert replied calmly. "Helen knew from day one that I'm a mechanic, that I live in a simple house, that I don't have much money. Even so, she chose to stay with me." "Because you manipulated her feelings," Mrs. Diana accused. "Enough!" Helen shouted, slamming her hand on the table. "Both of you get out of my house right now." "Helen—" Mrs. Diana tried to speak. "Now!" Helen repeated, pointing to the door. "I won't tolerate you insulting the man I love in my own home." "Helen, think carefully about what you're doing," Dr. Richard said as he headed to the door. "You're choosing between your family and a stranger." "I'm choosing between people who respect me and people who don't," Helen corrected. After they left, Helen collapsed on the couch, shaking with anger and emotion. Robert sat beside her, carefully embracing her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to fight with your family because of me." "You didn't cause anything," Helen reassured him. "My mother just can't accept that I've grown up, that I have the right to make my own choices." "But if this creates a permanent problem between you—" "Robert, look at me," Helen said, holding his face. "My mother will have to learn to accept me for who I am. If she chooses prejudice over my happiness, that's her problem." Robert kissed her, admiring that woman's strength and determination. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you too," Helen replied. "And we'll stay together no matter what." But the situation with Mrs. Diana was far from resolved. During the following days, she called Helen several times, trying to convince her to reconsider the relationship with Robert. "Helen, honey, I know you're angry with me," said Mrs. Diana in one of the calls, "but you need to understand that I only want what's best for you." "What's best for me is being with Robert," Helen replied wearily. "When will you accept this?" "Never," Mrs. Diana was direct, "because I know you'll regret it." "Then I think it's better if we stop talking for a while," Helen said, with a heavy heart but determined. "Helen, don't do this." "Mum, when you're ready to respect my choices, call me," Helen said before hanging up. Robert noticed how downcast Helen became after that conversation. "Maybe I should talk to your mother," he suggested. "Explain my intentions." "Robert, it's no use," Helen sighed. "My mother has already decided you're no good, no matter what you do or say. But she's your mother. You've always been close." "We were," Helen corrected. "But that was before I discovered she only accepts me when I do what she wants." The situation became even more complicated when Mrs. Barbara told Helen that Mrs. Diana had shown up at the office when she wasn't there, trying to convince the secretary to spy on their relationship. "Doctor, your mother offered me money to tell her whenever Robert came here." "Mrs." Barbara revealed, outraged. "She did what?" Helen was horrified. "She said it was for your own good," Mrs. Barbara continued. "Of course I refused. I work for you, not for her." Helen couldn't believe the lengths her mother was willing to go to separate her from Robert. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Barbara," Helen said. "And thank you for not accepting." "Doctor, may I give an opinion?" the secretary asked. "Of course." "Your mother is afraid of losing you," Mrs. Barbara said wisely. "After your accident, she got used to being indispensable in your life. Now that Robert has appeared, she feels she's being replaced." Helen had never thought of it that way. Perhaps her mother's behavior wasn't just prejudice, but also fear of abandonment. When she told this to Robert, he had an idea. What if I tried to talk to her anyway? He suggested. Not to convince her that I'm good enough, but to show that I don't want to take you away from her. She'll never see you, Helen said. Then I'll show up wherever she is, Robert said determinedly. I'll go to her office, to her house, wherever necessary. Mrs. Diana was a psychologist and had an office in the River North neighborhood. Robert found the address and decided to show up there one Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Diana's secretary, a young woman about 25 years old, was surprised when Robert introduced himself. Dr. Diana doesn't see anyone without an appointment, she said. Then I'll wait, Robert replied, sitting in the waiting room. As long as it takes. Robert waited for 3 hours. Other patients arrived and were seen, but Mrs. Diana refused to speak with him. Finally, at 7 in the evening, when the office was closing, she came out of her room. What do you want, you? She asked coldly. 5 minutes of your attention, Robert replied respectfully. I have nothing to say to you. But I have something to say to you, Robert insisted. About Helen. Mrs. Diana hesitated. Robert realized he had hit the right spot. 5 minutes. She finally gave in. They sat in the empty waiting room. Robert took a deep breath before starting. Mrs. Diana, I know you hate me, he began. And I understand why. You do? She asked, surprised by the approach. Yes, I do, Robert confirmed. You raised a wonderful daughter, took care of her all her life, especially after the accident, and now a stranger has appeared who's taking away the most important person in your life. Mrs. Diana fell silent, clearly not expecting that response. But I didn't come here to take Helen away from you, Robert continued. I came to ask to be part of the family, to take care of her together with you. You can't take care of her the way she deserves, Mrs. Diana said, but with less conviction than before. You're right, Robert agreed, surprising her again. I can't give her a mansion, expensive cars, or trips abroad, but I can give her my unconditional love, my total dedication and a happy life. And when the love fades, when you get tired of the limitations that a relationship with her requires, Robert looked directly into her eyes. Mrs. Diana, I didn't fall in love with Helen despite her limitations, he said sincerely. I fell in love with her exactly as she is, completely. Her limitations are part of her, and I love every part. Pretty words, Mrs. Diana murmured, but Robert noticed she was actually listening. They're not just words, Robert said. Let me tell you how I really met Helen. Robert told the whole story, the nervousness of the blind date, how he sat at the wrong table, how he was charmed by Helen from the first moment. When I saw she was in a wheelchair, do you know what my first thought was? Robert asked. That you'd gotten yourself into trouble, Mrs. Diana answered cynically. That she had the most beautiful eyes I'd ever seen in my life, Robert corrected. The wheelchair was literally the last thing I noticed. Mrs. Diana was silent for a few seconds. And when you found out she had money, she finally asked. I was intimidated, Robert admitted honestly, because I thought maybe I wasn't good enough for her. But Helen showed me that value isn't measured in money. Do you really believe that? I do, Robert said with conviction. And I can prove it. He took a paper from his pocket and handed it to Mrs. Diana. What is this? It's a contract, Robert explained. I had a lawyer draw it up. If I marry Helen, I renounce any rights to her assets. Inheritance, practice, house, everything remains solely in her name. Mrs. Diana read the document, incredulous. Why did you do this? To prove my interest in her is genuine, Robert answered. And for you to be sure, I'll never take anything from Helen, only give. And if she wants to share her assets with you? That's her decision, Robert said simply. But I won't ask for or accept anything she doesn't want to give of her own free will. Mrs. Diana folded the paper and put it in her purse. This doesn't change the fact that you're from different worlds, she said, but Robert noticed the hostility had lessened. That's true, Robert agreed. But that's what love is. It's finding someone who completes you, even if they're different from you. And if Helen gets tired of that difference? If that happens, I'll leave, Robert said without hesitation, because what I want is her happiness. If one day she's happier without me, I'll accept that. Mrs. Diana studied him silently for a few seconds. You really do love her, don't you? More than my own life, Robert confirmed. 5 minutes are up, Mrs. Diana said, standing up. Mrs. Diana, Robert called out before she left, you don't have to like me. You just need to let Helen be happy. She looked at him one last time before leaving without a reply. Robert went home not knowing if he had accomplished anything or if he had made the situation even worse. He decided not to tell Helen about the conversation, at least not yet. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, Helen received an unexpected call from her mother. "Helen, can we talk?" Mrs. Diana asked in a different voice. "It depends on the subject," Helen replied cautiously. "About Robert," her mother said. "I think I need to get to know him better." Helen almost dropped the phone in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Invite him for lunch at home on Sunday," Mrs. Diana said. "If he's so important to you, I need to give him a chance." "Mom, what happened?" Helen asked, suspicious of the sudden change. "Maybe I was too hasty," Mrs. Diana admitted, "and maybe I'm afraid of losing you." Helen felt her eyes fill with tears. It was the first time her mother had shown vulnerability about that situation. "Mom, you'll never lose me," Helen said emotionally. "But you need to accept that I've grown up." "I know, dear," Mrs. Diana sighed. "It's just hard after taking care of you alone for so long." "You won't be alone," Helen said gently. "You'll have 2 people taking care of you now." "Will you come for lunch?" "I'll ask Robert," Helen promised. "But, Mom, you have to promise you'll behave." "I promise to try," Mrs. Diana said, and Helen accepted that as progress. When Helen told Robert about the invitation, he got nervous but accepted. "Your mother changed her mind very quickly," he commented. "Do you think it's a trap?" "My mother is many things, but she's not fake," Helen reassured him. "If she invited you, it's because she's willing to try." "And what should I bring? Flowers? Wine?" Robert asked anxiously. "Just bring yourself," Helen smiled. "That's all you need." On Sunday, Robert dressed in the best he had, navy blue dress pants and a well-ironed white shirt. Helen wore a floral dress that Robert loved and that made her even prettier. Mrs. Diana's house was in the Bel Air neighborhood, in an upscale area of Chicago. It was a large, well-decorated house, but cozy. Robert felt a little intimidated, but Helen held his hand all the way to the door. "Relax," she murmured. "Everything will be fine." Mrs. Diana greeted them at the door, wearing an elegant but understated outfit. Robert noticed she had dressed up especially for the occasion. "Robert," she greeted him, extending her hand. "Mrs. Diana," he replied, shaking her hand firmly but without overdoing it. "Thank you for coming," she said, and Robert could tell she was sincere. The house smelled deliciously of homemade food. Mrs. Diana had prepared a full lunch, salad as a starter, rice, cowboy beans, roast beef with potatoes, and dulce de leche for dessert. "Wow, what a wonderful smell," Robert commented sincerely. "I hope you like it," Mrs. Diana said, seeming a bit nervous too. During lunch, the conversation was initially formal but gradually became more natural. Mrs. Diana asked about Robert's work, and he talked about his workshop with passion and pride. "My father always said there's no small job, only small workers," Robert shared. "He taught me that any profession has dignity if you do it with honesty and dedication." "Your father seems to have been a wise man," Mrs. Diana commented. "He was," Robert agreed. "He died young from working too hard. But he left an example I try to follow every day." Helen watched the conversation with joy, seeing that her mother was genuinely trying to get to know Robert. "And your family, Robert?" Mrs. Diana asked. "Helen told me you lost your parents." "I lost my father when I was 25, Robert shared. "My mother died when I was 15. Since then, it's just been me and the workshop." "That must have been hard," Mrs. Diana said sincerely. "It was," Robert admitted. "But it taught me to value the people who come into our lives. Family isn't just blood, it's who chooses to stay with us." Robert looked at Helen as he said this, and Mrs. Diana didn't miss the affectionate glance between them. "Robert," Mrs. Diana said after dessert, "can I be direct with you?" "Of course," Robert replied, bracing himself for what was to come. "I'm afraid," she admitted. afraid that Helen might get hurt, afraid that you might tire of her, afraid of losing my daughter." "Mrs. Diana," Robert said gently, "your fears are understandable, but I can assure you of one thing. Before I'd ever hurt Helen, I would disappear from her life. And if you have problems, every couple does." "We'll work it out by talking," Robert answered, "as adults do. And if you find that the social differences between you are greater than you imagined—" Robert thought for a moment before responding. "Mrs. Diana, love isn't about having everything in common," he said. "It's about accepting differences and growing together. Helen makes me want to be a better person, and I hope to do the same for her." Mrs. Diana nodded slowly. "Helen," she turned to her daughter, "are you happy with him?" "Very," Helen replied without hesitation. "Happier than I've ever been in my life." "And you, Robert?" Mrs. Diana continued. "Are you happy with her?" "Mrs. Diana, your daughter has transformed my life," Robert said emotionally. "Before I met her, I just existed. Now I live." Mrs. Diana fell silent for a few seconds, processing everything she had heard and observed. "I think I need to apologize," she finally said, "to both of you." "Mom," Helen began. "No, Helen, let me speak," Mrs. Diana interrupted her. "I've been prejudiced, controlling, and disrespectful. Robert, I'm sorry for how I treated you." "Thank you," Robert said simply. "But I still have one condition," Mrs. Diana continued. Helen and Robert exchanged tense glances. "I want to be part of your lives," she said. "I don't want to be pushed away. Promise you'll include me in your plans." Helen got up from her chair and hugged her mother, moved. "Of course, Mom," she said, crying with relief. "You'll always be part of our lives." Robert was also touched seeing that reconciliation. He knew how important it was for Helen to have her mother's approval. "Robert," Mrs. Diana called him, "can I give you a hug?" "Of course," Robert replied, standing up. The hug was sincere, full of acceptance and silent apologies. "Welcome to the family," Mrs. Diana murmured. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. After that lunch, the relationship between Robert and Mrs. Diana changed completely. She started calling Helen to ask about him, inviting them to dinner together, and even asking Robert for advice about her car. "My mother adores you," Helen commented one afternoon. "I think she was really afraid of losing me." "And now?" Robert asked. "Now she understands she's gained a son, not lost a daughter," Helen smiled. Mrs. Diana's change in behavior also influenced other people around them. Helen's sister, who lived in New York and had sided with their mother in opposing the relationship, called asking to meet Robert. "My sister wants to come spend a weekend here," Helen told Robert, "to meet the famous brother-in-law." "I'm nervous," Robert confessed. "What if she doesn't like me?" "Impossible," Helen said, kissing him. "You're irresistible." Helen's sister, Patricia, arrived on a Friday night. She was 2 years younger than Helen, married for 10 years and a mother of 2. Robert was surprised to see she looked nothing like Helen. She was brunette, shorter, and had a more outgoing manner. "So you're Robert," Patricia said as soon as she met him. "The man who managed to win over my workaholic sister. I think she's the one who won me over," Robert replied, making Patricia smile. Over the weekend, Patricia bombarded Robert with questions about everything: his family, his work, his future plans. But unlike her mother, her questions came from genuine curiosity, not suspicion. "Can I be honest with you?" Patricia asked on Sunday, when Helen had gone out to buy lunch. "Of course." Helen never had luck with men, Patricia told him. Before the accident, they just wanted to take advantage of her. After the accident, they see her as a poor thing. You're the first one who seems to see her as a woman. "That's how I see her," Robert confirmed, "as the most incredible woman I've ever met." "Great," Patricia smiled. "Because if you hurt her, I'd have to come from New York just to give you a few slaps." Robert laughed, liking Patricia's protective yet caring way. "That won't be necessary," he promised. When Helen returned from shopping, she found Robert and Patricia laughing together in the kitchen. "What are you two talking about?" she asked curiously. "I was telling Robert about that college boyfriend of yours who showed up drunk at your 21st birthday," Patricia said, making Helen blush. Patricia, Helen protested. What? Her sister laughed. It's good for him to know he has a high standard to beat. Robert enjoyed hearing stories about Helen's past. It was a way to get to know her even better. During lunch, Patricia talked about her life in New York, her executive husband and school-aged children, but Robert noticed that, despite the seemingly perfect life, there was something nostalgic in her voice when she talked about Chicago. Do you miss living here? Robert asked. A lot, Patricia admitted. But my husband's job is there, and the kids are settled. What if you came back someday? Helen asked hopefully. Who knows, Patricia smiled. Especially now that I'll have a brother-in-law to protect my daughters from unsuitable suitors. Robert was touched to realize Patricia already considered him part of the family. It'll be my pleasure, he said, smiling. When Patricia left, she left Helen and Robert with a warm family feeling. Robert had never experienced that sense of belonging to a group, of having people who cared about him. Your family is amazing, he commented. Our family, Helen corrected. Now you're part of it too. That week, Robert made an important decision. He went to a jewelry store downtown Chicago to buy an engagement ring. It wasn't an expensive store, but the ring he chose was simple and elegant, the way he knew Helen would like it. Is this for a marriage proposal? The saleswoman asked. Yes, Robert confirmed, smiling nervously. Are you sure about the size? Robert had discreetly observed Helen's rings for weeks to be certain. I am, he said. He paid for the ring in cash, using all his savings from the past few months. He knew Helen wouldn't care if the ring was expensive or cheap, but he wanted to give her something she could wear with pride. Now he needed to plan how to propose. Robert wanted it to be special, but at the same time intimate and personal. He decided it would be at his workshop at the end of a workday. That was where he was most himself, where he felt most confident. And I wanted Helen to accept him exactly as he was. One Thursday afternoon, Robert asked Helen to stop by the workshop after work. He said there was something special he wanted to show her. When Helen arrived, she found the workshop transformed. Robert had cleaned everything, placed candles in the corners and flowers in the spots where car parts usually sat. There was also a small table with 2 glasses and a bottle of sparkling wine. Robert, how beautiful, Helen exclaimed. What is all this? It's a celebration, Robert said, looking nervous, of everything we've built together. They sat at the improvised table, toasting with sparkling wine as Robert told her about his workday. Helen noticed he was more nervous than usual, but didn't know why. Helen, Robert said after they finished drinking, there's something I need to tell you. What is it? She asked, noticing the seriousness in his tone. Robert stood up and knelt in front of her chair. Helen's heart raced when she saw what was happening. Helen Anderson, Robert said, taking the ring out of his pocket, you've transformed my life in a way I never thought possible. Helen brought her hands to her face, her eyes already filled with tears. Before I met you, I just existed. I worked, ate, slept, and that was it. I had no dreams, no hopes. I didn't believe in love, Robert continued, his voice choked. Sayu taught me it's possible to love someone more than life itself. Robert, Helen murmured, moved. I know I can't give you luxury, expensive trips, or a life of wealth, he said honestly. But I can give you unconditional love, total dedication, and a life full of small, happy moments. Robert opened the ring box, revealing the simple but beautiful solitaire. Helen, will you marry me? He finally asked. Helen couldn't stop crying. She looked at that man kneeling in front of her, in the middle of the workshop that smelled of oil and metal, and knew she had never seen anything more beautiful in her life. Yes, she said through tears. 1,000 times, yes. Robert placed the ring on her finger, and they kissed right there on the workshop floor, surrounded by work tools and the candles that created a magical atmosphere. I love you, Helen murmured against his lips. I love you more, Robert replied. They held each other for several minutes, taking in what had just happened. They were engaged. They were going to build a life together. The ring is perfect, Helen said, admiring the jewel on her finger. Isn't it too simple? Robert asked, still unsure. It's perfect because it came from you, Helen reassured him. and because it represents true love. That night they called the whole family to share the news. Mrs. Diana cried with joy on the phone, Patricia screamed with excitement, and old George, when he found out the next day, gave Robert a hug that nearly knocked him over. "Son, what joy," said the longest-serving employee. "Your father would be so proud." "Do you really think so?" Robert asked, moved. "I'm sure," old George confirmed. "You've found someone who's good for you, and that's all a father wants for his son." In the following days, Robert and Helen began planning the wedding. They decided it would be something simple, with only family and close friends. "How about we do it right here in the workshop?" Helen suggested. "It's where you proposed to me. It would be symbolic." "In the workshop?" Robert repeated, surprised. "Are you sure? Won't your mother think it's too informal?" "My mother will think it's beautiful," Helen assured him, "especially when she finds out it was my idea." And that's exactly what happened. When they heard about the idea, both Mrs. Diana and Patricia found it romantic and original. "It's so you," commented Patricia, "authentic and full of meaning." They scheduled the wedding for 2 months after the engagement on a Saturday afternoon. The workshop would be decorated with white flowers and lights, creating a rustic yet elegant atmosphere. Helen chose a simple but beautiful dress, without a veil that would look good in her wheelchair. Robert bought his first ever suit, navy blue as Helen liked. "It will be the most beautiful wedding I've ever seen," commented Mrs. Barbara, who was in charge of helping with the details. 2 weeks before the wedding, Robert received a surprise. Old George had invited some mechanic friends from the area to form a small choir that would sing during the ceremony. "Old George, you didn't have to do this," Robert said emotionally. "Of course I did," the older man replied. "You're like a son to me. I want your wedding to be unforgettable." Helen also had her surprises. Her physical therapist colleagues organized a special bridal shower with practical gifts for the new house she and Robert had rented. It was a small but cozy house in the Logan Square neighborhood, with all the necessary adaptations for Helen. Robert had insisted on personally adapting every detail, installing grab bars and adjusting heights. "It's perfect," Helen said the day they went to see the finished house. "It's ours," Robert corrected her, kissing her. During the wedding week, Helen received an unexpected call. It was Gabriel, the boy she had helped at the hospital months before. "Aunt Helen, I heard you're getting married." The boy's voice sounded joyful on the phone. "You heard right, my dear." Helen smiled. "How are you?" "I'm doing very well. I can already stand with support," Gabriel proudly shared. "And I wanted to know if I can come to your wedding." Helen was moved. Gabriel represented so much of what she loved about her profession: hope, overcoming challenges, the joy of living. "Of course you can," she replied. "It would be an honor to have you there." "And can I bring something I made for you?" "Of course you can." On the wedding day, the weather was perfect. Strong sun, but with a pleasant breeze. The workshop was transformed into a magical place, with flowers everywhere and chairs arranged in 2 small rows. Robert had been nervous since morning. Old George had to calm him down several times. "Boy, relax," the senior employee said. "Today is the happiest day of your life." "What if I say something stupid during the vows?" Robert asked anxiously. "Speak from the heart and it will work out," old George advised. The guests began arriving at 3 in the afternoon. There were about 40 people: Mrs. Diana, Patricia with her family, Melissa, Mrs. Barbara, some of Helen's co-workers, Robert's mechanic friends, and of course Gabriel with his parents. The boy arrived in a new wheelchair, but Robert and Helen were moved to see him manage to stand up and take a few steps with support. "Aunt Helen," Gabriel shouted when he saw her, "I brought a special gift." It was a drawing he had made, Robert and Helen at the altar, surrounded by hearts. In the corner it was written, "For the aunt and uncle who taught me that love can do anything." "It's beautiful, my dear," Helen said, kissing the boy's forehead. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock. The officiant was a friend of Mrs. Diana, a pastor who agreed to perform a simple yet meaningful ceremony. Robert waited at the makeshift altar, next to a workbench decorated with flowers. When the music started and Helen appeared, escorted by Mrs. Diana, he felt tears streaming down his face. Helen was radiant. The white dress enhanced her natural beauty, and the smile on her face lit up the entire workshop. "You look beautiful," Robert murmured when she reached the altar. "You do too," she replied, wiping his tears. The ceremony was simple but moving. They exchanged personal vows they had written. "Helen," Robert said, his voice choked with emotion, "I promise to love you every day of my life, in good times and bad. I promise to be your companion, your friend, your confidant. I promise to never hide anything from you and always treat you like the wonderful woman you are." "Robert," Helen replied, equally moved, "I promise to love you just as you are, without wanting to change you. I promise to support your dreams, share my joys and sorrows, and build a beautiful family by your side." When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," Robert knelt again to be at her height, and they kissed under the emotional applause of the guests. The reception was held in the workshop itself, with a simple but tasty buffet served on tables set up between the workbenches. Mrs. Diana had hired a guitarist who played romantic songs all afternoon. Gabriel asked to make a special toast. "Uncle Robert and Aunt Helen," the boy said, standing, leaning on his crutches, "you taught me that love is taking care of each other. May you be very happy." Everyone toasted emotionally, and Robert picked Gabriel up for a photo. During the party, old George told funny stories about Robert. Patricia revealed childhood pranks of Helen, and Mrs. Diana gave an emotional speech about how she had learned that love knows no social class. "Welcome to our family, Robert," she said, hugging her son-in-law. "Thank you for giving me a family, Mrs. Diana," Robert replied emotionally. When the sun began to set, Robert and Helen said goodbye to the guests. They would spend their honeymoon at a simple inn in Galena, 2 hours from Chicago. "It was perfect," Helen said when they were finally alone. "It was so us," Robert agreed, hugging his wife. 3 months after the wedding, Helen discovered she was pregnant. It was a surprise for both of them, but a happy surprise. "A baby," Robert said in disbelief, looking at the test result. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Helen asked, a little apprehensive. "I'm over the moon," Robert replied, kissing her. "I can't wait to teach our son all about engines." "What if it's a girl?" Helen laughed. "I'll teach her about engines too," Robert said determinedly, "and you'll teach her about physical therapy." Helen's pregnancy went smoothly. Robert became even more protective, always making sure she didn't get too tired at the clinic. "You're treating me like I'm made of glass," Helen complained, but in an affectionate way. "You're carrying the most precious thing in the world," Robert replied, kissing her belly. Mrs. Diana was thrilled with the news that she would be a grandmother. She started making plans for the baby's room, buying little clothes and books about newborn care. "Mom, there are still 6 months left." Helen laughed at her mother's eagerness. "That's not much time to prepare," Mrs. Diana replied. Gabriel was also excited when he learned about the pregnancy. "I'm going to be like an older cousin," he said excitedly. "I can teach the baby to be brave." At 7 months pregnant, Helen and Robert found out it would be a boy. They decided to name him Michael in honor of Robert's father. "Dad would be happy," Robert said emotionally, touching Helen's belly. "And he is happy," Helen corrected him. "I'm sure he's watching everything from where he is." Michael was born on a sunny March morning, after 6 hours of labor. Robert was in the delivery room holding Helen's hand throughout the entire process. "It's a beautiful boy," said the obstetrician, showing them the baby. Robert cried when he saw his son for the first time. He was tiny but perfect, with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. "Hi, Michael," Helen murmured when they placed the baby in her arms. "I'm your mummy." "And I'm your daddy," Robert said, carefully touching his son's tiny hand. The first night at the hospital was pure emotion. Robert didn't leave Helen and Michael's side for a single minute. "Thank you," he told Helen in the middle of the night. "Why?" "For giving me a family," Robert replied. "For making me the happiest man in the world." "We're the ones who thank you," Helen said, looking at Michael sleeping in her lap, "for giving us so much love." In the following months, Robert proved to be a dedicated and caring father. He woke up at dawn for feedings, changed diapers, gave baths, and sang lullabies he made up on the spot. "You're a natural father," observed Mrs. Diana one afternoon, watching Robert play with Michael on the living room floor. "I learned by watching you take care of Helen," Robert said, "and trying to give him everything I never had." "He'll have lots of love," Mrs. Diana smiled. "That's what matters most." When Michael turned 1, Robert made an important decision. He decided to expand the workshop, hiring more employees and offering mechanics courses for underprivileged youth in the community. "I want to give opportunities to other young men like me," he explained to Helen, "who didn't have the chance to study but want to work honestly." "It's a beautiful idea," Helen supported. "I can help with contacts and promotion." The project succeeded. Within 6 months, Robert had trained a class of 10 young men, and 3 of them had already gotten jobs at other workshops in the city. "You're changing lives," commented old George, proud of his former apprentice. "I'm giving back what life gave me," Robert replied. Helen also expanded her practice, creating a free care program for underprivileged children. Gabriel, now 15 and walking with the aid of crutches, became a kind of assistant, helping motivate other patients. "Aunt Helen saved my life," he told the new children, "and you'll make it too." 2 years after Michael's birth, Helen discovered she was pregnant again. This time it would be a girl whom they decided to name Claire. "Our family is growing," Robert said emotionally, touching Helen's belly. "And our happiness too," Helen added. Claire was born in late autumn, a calm and smiling baby who brought even more joy to the house. Michael, now 2 years old, was enchanted with his little sister. "Baby Claire," he said, trying to pronounce the name. "She's your little sister," Robert explained patiently. "You'll take care of her." The Johnson family's house became too small with Claire's arrival, so they moved to a larger house in the same neighborhood. Robert made sure to personally adapt each space to Helen's and the children's needs. "Our perfect house," Helen said on moving day, watching Robert install the final adjustments. "Our dream house," Robert agreed. Mrs. Diana moved into a house on the same street to be close to her grandchildren. At 68, she had become the most dedicated grandmother in the world. "Grandma Diana," Michael shouted every morning when he saw her coming. "Grandpa George," he yelled when old George, whom they had adopted as a grandfather, came to visit. Robert's workshop became one of the most respected in the area, not only for the quality of work, but for the social programs it developed. Helen became a reference in pediatric physical therapy in Chicago. But most importantly, they became a strong, united, and happy family. Every Sunday they gathered for family lunches, where they told stories, played with the children, and planned the future. "Remember the first time we saw each other?" Helen asked on one of those Sundays, when Michael was 5 and Claire was 3. "When I sat at the wrong table," Robert laughed. "Best mistake of my life." "It wasn't a mistake," said Michael, who already knew his parents' story. "It was love." "It's true, my love," Helen confirmed. "It was love that brought us together. And it's love that keeps us together," Robert added, kissing his wife. Gabriel, now 18 and walking without assistance, had become a physical therapist too, inspired by Helen. He remained an honorary member of the Johnson family. "Aunt and Uncle, can I say something?" he asked that Sunday. "Of course, my dear," Helen replied. "You taught me that family isn't just those you're born with," Gabriel said emotionally. "It's who you choose to stay with, to love with, to grow with." Robert and Helen looked at each other, remembering how that journey had begun. 2 strangers who sat at the wrong table and discovered it was exactly where they were meant to be. "It's true," Robert said, embracing the whole family. "Family is who we choose to love." Years later, when Michael and Claire were already teenagers, Robert and Helen returned to the Mountain Corner restaurant to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary. "Table 7, Robert requested from the waiter. "The lover's table," the employee smiled. "It's always reserved for you." They sat at the table where it all began, more mature, with some grey hairs, but with the same sparkle in their eyes from their first meeting. "If someone had told me 10 years ago that I would be this happy," Robert said, holding Helen's hand across the table. "Would you have believed it?" Helen asked. "No," Robert admitted. "But now I know that love happens when we least expect it, in the most unlikely way possible." "Like sitting at the wrong table," Helen smiled. "Like sitting at the right table," Robert corrected her, kissing her hand. They toasted with wine, celebrating not just their wedding anniversary, but the entire life they had built together. Their wonderful children, the united families, the jobs they loved, and most of all, the love that grew every day. To 10 more years, Robert said, raising his glass. To 50 more years, Helen corrected him. To forever, they said together, sealing the toast with a kiss. Across the restaurant, a young couple was arguing about a wrong table. Robert and Helen smiled at each other, remembering that sometimes the best meetings start with the biggest mistakes, and so they lived happily ever after, proving that true love doesn't choose place, social condition, or physical situation. Love simply happens when two people are ready to accept each other, to love each other, and to build a life together, one wrong table at a time. End of story. Now tell us, what did you think of this love story? Do you believe love can overcome all differences? Share with us your experiences about unexpected encounters and how small mistakes can completely change our lives. Leave your like if the story touched your heart and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one. Thank you very much for your company.